Hello, my sleepy friends. When people imagine the world of the Vikings, they often picture long ships cutting through cold northern seas, warriors carrying shields and axes, and villages surrounded by forests and snow. Yet behind these dramatic images existed a quieter and more personal side of Viking life that historians have spent many years trying to understand. Like every society in history, the Vikings had their own ideas about love, marriage, family life, and relationships between men and women. These ideas were shaped by their harsh environment, their traditions, and the social rules that guided daily life in the Norse world. To understand what relationships were like for the Vikings, it helps to first imagine the setting in which people lived. Viking communities were usually small farming settlements spread across Scandinavia, including areas that are today Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Life in these northern regions could be difficult. Winters were long and dark, and survival depended on cooperation between families and neighbors. In such a world, relationships between men and women were not only emotional connections but also practical partnerships that helped households survive. Marriage was one of the most important institutions in Viking society. Unlike modern ideas of romance where individuals freely choose partners based entirely on personal feelings, Viking marriages were often arranged between families. These arrangements were usually made to strengthen alliances, secure property, or bring stability to communities. Families discussed marriage agreements carefully, considering factors such as land ownership, reputation, and family connections. A Viking wedding was not simply a private event between two individuals. It was a public agreement that involved entire families, and sometimes even local leaders. Ceremonies often included feasts, gifts, and gatherings that could last for several days. These celebrations allowed communities to witness the new union and recognize the partnership that had been formed. Within Viking marriages, both men and women held important roles inside the household. Viking farms required constant work to survive the harsh northern climate. Men often handled activities such as long-distance travel, trading, fishing, and occasionally raiding during the Viking Age. Women, meanwhile, managed many aspects of daily life at home. They oversaw food preparation, textile production, household organization, and the raising of children. Because women controlled the household economy, they held a level of influence that sometimes surprises modern readers. Archaeological evidence and historical texts suggest that Viking women could manage property, control household goods, and sometimes even request divorce if a marriage became unacceptable. While Viking society was still largely dominated by men, women were not completely powerless within family structures. Norse mythology and literature also reveal interesting clues about how relationships were viewed in Viking culture. Stories recorded in the Icelandic sagas often describe marriages, romantic relationships, jealousy, loyalty, and family disputes. These stories show that emotions such as love, attraction, and rivalry were familiar parts of Viking life, just as they are today. At the same time, Viking society placed strong emphasis on honor and reputation. A person's behavior in relationships could affect how others viewed their family. Maintaining honor was extremely important in Norse culture, and actions that damaged a family's reputation could create long-lasting conflicts between communities. Another aspect that shaped relationships in Viking society was the importance of lineage. Families wanted to ensure that property, land, and wealth passed to future generations. Having children was therefore seen as an important responsibility within marriage. Children not only continued family lines but also helped maintain farms and support parents as they grew older. Because Viking communities were relatively small, social rules surrounding relationships were often closely observed by neighbors and relatives. Everyone in a village knew each other, and family reputations could spread quickly through word of mouth. This created an environment where relationships were not purely private matters, but part of the larger social structure of the community. As we continue exploring the realities of relationships in Viking society, it becomes clear that the Norse world balanced practical survival with personal connections. Marriage, family life, and partnerships were deeply connected to the survival of households in a demanding environment. Understanding these social rules helps reveal a more human side of the Vikings, far beyond the dramatic stories of battles and voyages that often dominate popular history. And as we move deeper into the daily life of Viking communities, we begin to uncover how traditions, expectations, and cultural beliefs shaped relationships across the cold northern lands of Scandinavia. As life continued inside Viking settlements scattered across the coasts and valleys of Scandinavia, relationships between men and women remained closely connected to the realities of survival in the northern world. Viking farms were not quiet places where individuals lived separate lives. They were busy centers of activity where entire families worked together from sunrise until nightfall. Fields had to be planted and harvested. Animals needed constant care. Fishing boats had to be prepared, and tools were repaired throughout the year. Within this environment, partnerships between husbands and wives were essential for keeping households functioning. Marriage in Viking society therefore carried responsibilities far beyond emotional companionship. A married couple formed the leadership of the household, and together they managed the resources that allowed their family to survive long winters and unpredictable weather. The success of the farm often depended on how well both partners fulfilled their roles. A strong household required cooperation, patience, and trust between husband and wife. When historians examine Viking relationships, they often turn to the Icelandic sagas, a collection of stories written down centuries later that preserved many traditions from the Viking Age. These sagas describe marriages, romantic conflicts, rivalries, and complicated family relationships. While the stories contain elements of legend, they still provide valuable glimpses into the expectations and cultural attitudes that shaped Viking society. From these sources we learn that attraction and affection certainly existed in Viking relationships, but marriages were still strongly influenced by practical concerns. Families carefully evaluated potential partners based on reputation, wealth, and family alliances. A marriage could strengthen ties between powerful families or secure control over valuable farmland. Because land was one of the most important resources in Viking society, marriage often played a key role in determining who controlled property across generations. Despite these practical considerations, the sagas also describe moments where personal feelings influenced relationships. Some stories tell of couples who developed deep loyalty and affection for each other, while others describe jealousy, betrayal, or complicated love triangles that created dramatic conflicts within communities. These stories remind us that Viking society was filled with the same human emotions that appear in every culture throughout history. The position of women within Viking relationships is particularly interesting when compared with many other societies from the same period. While Viking society remained patriarchal, women held certain legal rights that allowed them to maintain influence within the household. A married woman often controlled keys to the household storage rooms, symbolizing her authority over food supplies, textiles, and domestic goods. This responsibility meant she played a central role in managing the resources that kept the family alive. Women also had the right in some situations to request divorce if a marriage became harmful or unsustainable. Historical records and sagas suggest that a woman could leave her husband under certain circumstances, particularly if he failed to provide support or behaved dishonorably. Divorce required formal steps and witnesses, but the possibility itself shows that Viking women had more agency in relationships than many people expect. Children were another central part of Viking family life. Raising children was considered both a responsibility and an investment in the future of the household. Boys were often taught skills related to farming, hunting, and warfare, while girls learned tasks connected to weaving, cooking, and managing household resources. However, the division of roles was not always rigid, and individuals sometimes learned a wide range of practical skills needed to survive in their environment. Large families were beneficial for Viking farms because more hands meant more help with daily work. Children assisted with tasks such as caring for animals, collecting firewood, and preparing food. Over time, they grew into adults who could continue maintaining the farm and supporting the older generation. Another important aspect of Viking relationships involved social reputation. Honor was one of the most powerful values in Norse culture, and a person's behavior within relationships could influence how others viewed their entire family. Maintaining respect within the community was essential because Viking societies were relatively small and closely connected. Rumors, disputes, and personal conflicts could easily spread across villages and affect alliances between families. Because of this, people often paid careful attention to how relationships were conducted. Actions that damaged honor could lead to arguments, feuds, or long-lasting conflicts between households. These tensions sometimes appeared dramatically in the sagas, where disputes between families could continue for generations. When looking at the full picture of Viking relationships, it becomes clear that they were shaped by a combination of practical survival, cultural traditions, and human emotions. Partnerships between men and women were not simply personal arrangements, but part of a larger network of family alliances and community expectations. And as we continue exploring deeper into the world of Viking society, we begin to see how these relationships were influenced not only by everyday life on farms, but also by the broader cultural beliefs and traditions that defined the Norse world during the Viking Age. As Viking communities continued living along the rugged coasts and cold valleys of Scandinavia, daily life moved according to the rhythms of nature. The long winters forced families to spend months together inside wooden longhouses, while the short summers demanded intense labor in the fields and along the sea. Within these environments, relationships between men and women developed inside a social structure where family loyalty, reputation, and survival were closely connected. The Viking longhouse itself played an important role in shaping daily life and relationships. These large wooden buildings were not divided into many private rooms like modern houses. Instead, most activities happened inside one long shared space where families cooked, worked, slept, and spent time together. Fires burned in the center of the hall, sending smoke upward through openings in the roof, while benches and sleeping areas lined the walls. Because space inside the longhouse was shared, life was far less private than modern households, Families lived closely together, and the activities of one person were rarely hidden from others. This environment created a culture where personal relationships existed within the awareness of the wider household. Elders, children, relatives, and sometimes even guests or travelers could all be present under the same roof. Marriage in this environment meant becoming part of an extended household where cooperation was essential. A wife did not simply join her husband as a partner. She also became responsible for managing important parts of the household economy. Food supplies, stored grain, dairy products, woven textiles, and clothing all required careful management throughout the year. The importance of women in maintaining these resources gave them a respected position inside the household. Archaeological discoveries often include graves of Viking women buried with keys, tools, and jewelry that symbolized their role as managers of domestic life. These objects suggest that Viking society recognized the authority women held within the home. The sagas also describe many examples of strong-willed women who influenced decisions within their families. Some women advised husbands during conflicts, encouraged sons to defend family honor, or even helped shape political alliances between powerful families. These stories reveal that women were active participants in the social world around them. At the same time, Viking culture placed strong expectations on both men and women regarding loyalty within relationships. Marriage created bonds not only between two individuals but also between their families. Breaking those bonds could create serious tension between households, sometimes leading to disputes that spread through entire communities. Jealousy and rivalry appear frequently in the Icelandic sagas, where relationships between men and women sometimes triggered larger conflicts. A perceived insult, betrayal, or broken promise could lead to arguments that escalated into feuds lasting many years. These stories show how closely personal relationships were tied to the concept of honor in Viking culture. Honor shaped nearly every aspect of Viking life. A person's reputation determined how others treated them in trade, politics, and daily interactions. Maintaining respect within the community was essential, because losing honor could weaken a family's standing and reduce their influence. Children growing up in Viking households observed these values from an early age. They watched how their parents interacted, how disputes were handled, and how alliances between families were maintained. These lessons prepared them to eventually take on responsibilities within the same social structure. The role of storytelling also helped preserve ideas about relationships in Viking society. Long winter nights often brought families together around the fire where elders shared tales of heroes, travelers, and legendary figures. These stories included lessons about loyalty, bravery, betrayal, and the consequences of broken promises. Through these stories, younger generations learned about the expectations that shaped relationships in their culture. The sagas did not simply entertain listeners. They also reinforced values that guided behavior within Viking communities. When we examine the daily life of Viking households, it becomes clear that relationships were deeply connected to the environment and traditions surrounding them. Marriage, family cooperation, and community reputation all played roles in shaping how men and women interacted with each other. These relationships were not isolated from the rest of society. Instead, they existed within a network of responsibilities and expectations that helped Viking communities survive in a challenging northern landscape. And as we continue moving further into the social world of the Vikings, we begin to uncover how their beliefs, customs, and traditions shaped not only family life, but also the way they understood loyalty, partnership, and the bonds that connected people across the Norse world. As the seasons continued turning across the rugged landscapes of Scandinavia, Viking communities lived lives shaped by both nature and tradition. Long winters forced families to spend many months inside their wooden homes, while short summers demanded intense labor in the fields and along the sea. In this environment, relationships between men and women developed within a culture where survival depended heavily on cooperation and strong family bonds. Viking society placed great importance on household stability, because the household was the center of economic and social life. A farm was not only a place where people lived, but also the foundation of a family's survival and reputation. Land, livestock, stored food, and tools all needed careful management throughout the year. For this reason, marriage was often viewed as a partnership that strengthened the household rather than simply a personal relationship based only on emotion. When a marriage was arranged between families, negotiations sometimes took place regarding property, gifts, and responsibilities. These arrangements helped ensure that both families benefited from the union. Land ownership could expand, alliances could grow stronger, and resources could be shared more efficiently between households. These agreements often included wedding gifts, which were exchanged between the families of the bride and groom. These gifts could include livestock, weapons, jewelry, clothing, or even sections of farmland. The exchange of gifts symbolized the formation of a new partnership between families and helped establish trust between the two sides. The wedding celebrations themselves were important community events. Feasts could last for several days and included food, music, storytelling, and drinking. These gatherings allowed neighbors and relatives to witness the marriage and celebrate the creation of a new household within the community. Within Viking marriages, expectations existed for both partners. Men were often responsible for protecting the household, participating in trade or voyages, and maintaining the farm's external responsibilities. Women managed many of the internal aspects of daily life, overseeing food storage, weaving cloth, preparing meals, and organizing domestic work. However, Viking women were not limited only to domestic roles. Historical evidence suggests that some women participated in trade, managed farms while their husbands traveled, and held authority within their communities. Graves discovered by archaeologists have revealed women buried with valuable goods and symbols of status, suggesting that some held considerable influence within their society. The sagas also describe women who played important roles in shaping family decisions. In several stories, wives advised husbands during disputes or influenced how families responded to conflicts. Their voices were part of the social structure that guided Viking communities. At the same time, Viking culture placed strong emphasis on loyalty and trust within marriage. Because families were closely connected through alliances, betrayal within relationships could cause serious tension. Disputes between couples sometimes expanded into conflicts between entire families, especially if honor or reputation became involved. Honor was a powerful force in Viking society. A person's reputation determined how others treated them in trade, legal disputes, and social gatherings. Protecting family honor was therefore extremely important. Actions that damaged reputation could create lasting consequences, not only for individuals but also for their relatives. This emphasis on honor meant that relationships were often observed by the wider community. Neighbors, relatives, and local leaders all had interest in maintaining stability within households because family disputes could easily spread into larger feuds that affected entire villages. Children growing up in Viking homes learned these values by watching the behavior of adults around them. They saw how parents managed responsibilities, how disagreements were handled, and how families maintained alliances with neighbors. These lessons prepared them to eventually form their own households and continue the traditions of their society. In this way, Viking relationships were shaped by a combination of emotional connections, practical responsibilities, and cultural expectations. Marriage connected families together in ways that influenced property, reputation, and the stability of entire communities. When we look beyond the dramatic stories of Viking raids and battles, we begin to see a society where everyday life depended heavily on cooperation between men and women working together to maintain households in a demanding environment. And as we continue exploring deeper into Viking culture, we start to understand how these relationships form the foundation of family life across the Norse world, connecting generations through shared traditions and responsibilities. As Viking society continued developing across the northern lands of Scandinavia and the wider Norse world, relationships between men and women were influenced not only by daily life on farms, but also by the larger cultural traditions that shaped how people understood family, loyalty, and personal honor. Viking communities were closely connected networks where reputation, responsibility, and social expectations guided behavior in ways that affected both individuals and their families. One of the most important ideas in Viking culture was the concept of kinship, which meant that a person was deeply connected to their extended family and clan. These kinship ties influenced nearly every aspect of life, including marriage and relationships. When two people married, they did not simply form a partnership between themselves. Instead, their union created a connection between entire families, linking relatives through shared responsibilities and alliances. Because of this, families often paid careful attention when arranging marriages for their sons and daughters. They considered factors such as land ownership, family reputation, and the potential benefits that a marriage might bring to both sides. A well-planned marriage could strengthen alliances between powerful families or help smaller households gain stability and protection. The Icelandic sagas describe many such arrangements, where negotiations between families determined the future of marriages long before the ceremony itself took place. Elders from both sides sometimes met to discuss the terms of the agreement, including the exchange of gifts and responsibilities that each family would contribute to the new household. Despite these practical negotiations, Viking relationships still included strong emotional elements. The sagas contain many stories where individuals fell deeply in love, admired one another, or formed strong bonds that lasted throughout their lives. In some cases, love stories appear alongside tales of adventure and conflict, showing that personal relationships were an important part of Viking storytelling traditions. However, relationships could also become sources of tension. Jealousy, rivalry, and disputes between couples sometimes created larger conflicts within communities. Because Viking society placed so much importance on honor and reputation, disagreements inside a marriage could occasionally spread beyond the household and affect relationships between entire families. This is why maintaining harmony within the household was highly valued. A stable household meant that daily work could continue without interruption, allowing farms to remain productive and families to survive the difficult winters that characterized life in the north. The structure of Viking homes also influenced how families lived together. The longhouse remained the center of family life, providing shelter not only for immediate family members, but often for relatives, servants, and travelers as well. Inside these large wooden halls, daily activities unfolded around the central fire where meals were prepared and stories were shared. Evenings inside the longhouse were often times when families gathered together after long days of work. Elders might tell stories about legendary heroes or famous voyages, while children listened and learned about the traditions of their people. These moments of storytelling helped strengthen family bonds and preserve cultural knowledge for future generations. Viking religion and mythology also shaped how people viewed relationships and family life. The Norse gods themselves were often portrayed with complex relationships, marriages, and rivalries. Stories about gods like Odin, Thor, and Freyja included themes of loyalty, betrayal, and partnership that reflected human experiences within Viking society. These myths helped illustrate cultural values about honor, courage, and loyalty. By listening to these stories, Viking communities reinforced the expectations that guided relationships between men and women in their own lives. Another important factor shaping Viking relationships was the possibility of long journeys. Many Viking men traveled far from their homes, either through trade, exploration, or military expeditions. These journeys could last months or even years, leaving women responsible for managing farms and households during their absence. This responsibility required strong leadership and practical skills. Women who remained at home often supervised farm workers, managed food supplies, and ensured that the household continued operating smoothly until the travelers returned. These roles demonstrate how Viking women played crucial parts in maintaining the stability of their communities. Through all these aspects of daily life, relationships between men and women formed the foundation of Viking society. Marriage, family cooperation, and shared responsibilities allowed households to function effectively within a challenging environment where survival depended on teamwork and resilience. And as the Viking Age continued unfolding across Northern Europe, these partnerships between men and women helped sustain the farms, villages, and trading networks that supported one of the most dynamic societies of the early medieval world. As Viking communities continued to grow across Scandinavia and beyond, the structure of family life remained one of the most important foundations of Norse society. Every village, every farm, and every household depended on the stability of relationships between men and women who worked together to maintain the survival of their families. These partnerships were not only emotional connections, but also economic alliances that shaped the daily rhythm of life in the Viking world. In many Viking settlements, a household was much larger than what people today might imagine. A single farm could include not only a married couple and their children, but also elderly parents, younger relatives, workers, and sometimes enslaved individuals captured during raids or obtained through trade. All of these people lived and worked together within the same household system, creating a complex network of responsibilities and interactions. Because so many individuals shared the same living space, relationships developed within an environment where cooperation and social harmony were extremely important. Conflicts between individuals could disrupt the entire household, affecting productivity and creating tension within the community. For this reason, Viking culture placed strong emphasis on maintaining order within family life. The responsibilities within a Viking household were often divided according to experience and skill, rather than rigid rules alone. Men frequently focused on activities such as hunting, fishing, building ships, and traveling for trade or exploration. Women managed tasks that ensured the daily functioning of the home, including cooking, preserving food, weaving cloth, making clothing, and caring for children. Weaving was particularly important because cloth was a valuable resource in Viking society. Women spent many hours producing textiles that were used not only for clothing, but also for trade. High-quality fabric could be exchanged for goods from distant lands, meaning that the work done inside the household contributed directly to the broader economy of the Viking world. Marriage partnerships therefore combined the strengths of both individuals. A successful household required careful planning, cooperation, and shared responsibility between husband and wife. Their ability to work together determined whether the family would prosper or struggle in the demanding northern environment. The Icelandic sagas provide many detailed stories that illustrate how relationships functioned in Viking society. Some tales describe couples who remained loyal to each other through difficult circumstances, including long separations caused by voyages across the sea. Other stories show how disagreements between spouses sometimes created tension that spread into larger family disputes. These sagas were not simply entertainment. They served as cultural guides that reflected the values and expectations of Viking communities. By listening to these stories, people learned about the consequences of loyalty, betrayal, courage, and dishonor within relationships. Honor continued to play a powerful role in shaping Viking social life. A person's reputation influenced how others treated them in trade, politics, and everyday interactions. Because family honor was shared among relatives, the behavior of one individual could affect the standing of the entire household. For this reason, maintaining trust and loyalty within relationships was seen as essential for preserving the reputation of a family. Disputes between couples could sometimes escalate into conflicts between families, particularly if accusations of dishonor or betrayal were involved. Despite these challenges, Viking relationships were often characterized by strong partnerships built on shared responsibilities. Living in a harsh climate required resilience and cooperation, and many couples depended heavily on each other to maintain the stability of their homes. Children growing up in Viking households observed these partnerships every day. They watched how their parents divided tasks, resolved disagreements, and supported each other during difficult times. These experiences shaped the next generation's understanding of marriage and family responsibilities. As children matured, they gradually took on more responsibilities within the household. Boys learned skills related to farming, hunting, shipbuilding, and navigation, while girls learned textile production, food preparation, and household management. However, both boys and girls often gained experience in multiple areas because survival required flexibility and practical knowledge. By the time they reached adulthood, these young men and women were prepared to establish their own households and continue the traditions that had guided Viking society for generations. Through this system of shared responsibilities, strong family bonds, and cultural expectations, relationships between men and women became the foundation upon which Viking communities were built. These partnerships supported farms, maintained trade networks, and ensured the survival of families across the challenging landscapes of the Norse world. And as the Viking Age expanded through exploration, trade, and settlement across distant lands, the strength of these family relationships continued to shape the lives of the people who carried Norse culture far beyond the shores of Scandinavia. As Viking society continued expanding across Scandinavia and into distant lands through exploration and trade, the customs surrounding relationships and marriage remained deeply rooted in tradition. The Norse world valued stability within the household, because every family formed a small but essential part of the larger social structure. Farms, villages, and trading communities all depended on reliable family partnerships that could endure the harsh conditions of northern life. In the Viking Age, the household was often referred to as a heimer, meaning the center of home life where daily survival unfolded. Inside these homes, relationships between men and women were shaped by cooperation, mutual dependence, and cultural expectations passed down across generations. Life required constant effort, and this effort was shared between partners who worked together to maintain the household. Marriage agreements were often made with careful planning because they influenced not only the future of the couple, but also the fortunes of their families. Property, livestock, farmland, and trading connections were all factors that families considered when discussing potential marriages. These negotiations helped ensure that both sides benefited from the union, strengthening alliances that could support families through difficult times. Wedding ceremonies themselves were important social events within Viking communities. These celebrations often took place in large gatherings where relatives, neighbors, and travelers came together to witness the union. Feasts filled the halls with music, storytelling, and shared meals that could last for several days. Such gatherings reinforced the idea that marriage was not simply a private agreement, but a public commitment recognized by the community. Once married, couples worked closely together to manage the household economy. Viking farms required careful organization to maintain food supplies throughout the year. Grain had to be harvested and stored properly. Livestock required shelter during winter, and preserved food such as dried fish or smoked meat ensured that families had nourishment when resources became scarce. Women often managed the storage and distribution of these resources, making them central figures in maintaining the household's stability. Their role extended far beyond domestic chores, as they oversaw the systems that allowed families to survive months of cold weather and limited supplies. Men frequently traveled beyond the farm for trade, fishing expeditions, or voyages across the seas. The Viking Age is famous for these journeys, which carried Norse sailors to places as distant as the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, and even parts of North America. During these absences, women often assumed responsibility for managing farms and supervising workers who helped maintain the property. Archaeological discoveries have revealed that some Viking women were buried with keys, tools, and valuable goods that symbolized their authority within the household. These findings support the idea that women held respected positions in managing family life and resources. Relationships between couples were also influenced by the strong cultural emphasis on loyalty and honor. Viking society expected individuals to act in ways that protected the reputation of their families. A household that maintained its honor gained respect within the community, while behavior that damaged reputation could lead to disputes or loss of social standing. Because of this, loyalty within relationships was seen as important not only for personal reasons, but also for maintaining harmony within the broader social network of families and neighbors. Communities relied on cooperation between households, and maintaining trust between families helped prevent conflicts that could disrupt the stability of entire villages. The sagas again provide valuable glimpses into how these relationships were understood. In many stories, marriages are portrayed as partnerships built on shared strength and resilience. Some tales describe couples who supported each other during difficult times, while others show how misunderstandings or rivalries could create tension within families. These stories reflected real concerns within Viking communities. They explored how individuals balanced personal desires with responsibilities to their families and society. Through storytelling, people discussed the challenges of maintaining loyalty, managing jealousy, and preserving honor within relationships. Children growing up in Viking homes learned these lessons naturally by observing the behavior of adults around them. They watched how parents managed responsibilities, how disputes were resolved, and how alliances between families were maintained. These experiences prepared them for the day when they would form their own households and continue the traditions of their culture. Over time, these patterns of partnership, responsibility, and loyalty created a social system that helped Viking communities thrive in environments that demanded strength and cooperation. Relationships between men and women formed the foundation of this system, connecting individuals into families that supported each other through the challenges of life in the north. And as Viking explorers continued sailing across unknown waters and establishing settlements in distant lands, the traditions that shaped relationships at home traveled with them, carrying the values of Norse society far beyond the cold shores of Scandinavia. As the Viking Age continued unfolding across Northern Europe, the daily lives of Norse families remained closely tied to the rhythms of the land and sea. Viking communities did not live in isolation from one another. Farms, villages, and trading settlements formed networks connected by travel routes, marketplaces, and seasonal gatherings. These interactions allowed families to exchange goods, news, and stories, and they also influenced how relationships and marriages developed within the wider Norse world. In many cases, marriages were used to strengthen connections between distant communities. A family living along the Norwegian coast might arrange a marriage with another family from Denmark or Sweden in order to build alliances that supported trade or political cooperation. These arrangements created bonds that stretched across regions and helped maintain stability between groups that depended on one another. Such alliances were especially important during a time when travel and communication were difficult. A trusted family connection in another region could provide support during times of conflict or hardship. Because of this, marriages sometimes carried significance beyond the household itself, helping shape relationships between communities. The structure of Viking society encouraged strong partnerships inside the home. Life in northern climates required constant preparation and careful management of resources. Every season brought different responsibilities, and couples worked together to ensure that their households remained secure. During the spring and summer months, farming activities dominated daily life. Fields needed to be prepared, seeds planted, and livestock carefully watched as they grazed in nearby pastures. Harvest seasons required intense labor from entire households, with men, women, and children all contributing to gathering crops that would sustain the family through winter. Autumn brought the time for storing food supplies. Grain was dried and stored, vegetables were preserved, and meat or fish was smoked or salted to prevent spoilage. Women often managed these processes, ensuring that the household had enough provisions to survive the long months when fresh food was difficult to obtain. Winter, although quieter in terms of outdoor labor, became a time for indoor activities and family gatherings. Inside the longhouse, people repaired tools, produced clothing, and shared stories that preserved the traditions of their culture. These long evenings strengthened family bonds and allowed knowledge to pass from older generations to younger ones. The closeness of Viking households meant that relationships between couples were deeply woven into the everyday life of the family. Husbands and wives depended on each other to maintain stability within the home. Their partnership influenced everything from the success of the harvest to the well-being of their children. Another interesting aspect of Viking relationships was the importance of hospitality. Travelers, traders, and visitors frequently moved through Norse territories, and offering shelter to guests was considered an important cultural value. When strangers arrived at a household, they were often welcomed with food and a place to rest. This tradition of hospitality strengthened social connections between distant communities and allowed news and ideas to spread across the Viking world. Guests sometimes shared stories of faraway lands, bringing knowledge of new trade opportunities or distant events that might influence local decisions. The presence of visitors also meant that households often served as small centers of social interaction. Conversations around the fire included discussions of voyages, trade goods, and family matters that shaped the future of Viking communities. In this environment, relationships between couples were influenced by a constant flow of interaction with neighbors, relatives, and travelers. Families were rarely isolated, and their actions were often observed and remembered by those around them. Maintaining harmony within the household therefore carried importance not only for personal happiness, but also for preserving the reputation of the family within the wider community. Viking society valued individuals who demonstrated reliability, loyalty, and respect for their responsibilities. Through these daily interactions and shared traditions, Viking families created a culture where partnerships between men and women supported the stability of entire communities. Their relationships were part of a larger system of cooperation that allowed Norse society to survive and expand during the Viking Age. And as these communities continued spreading across northern seas and distant lands, the traditions that guided relationships at home traveled with them, shaping the lives of Viking settlers far beyond the original shores of Scandinavia. As Viking society continued spreading across the northern seas and distant lands, the traditions that shaped relationships and family life traveled with them. The Norse world was not limited only to the lands of Scandinavia. Over time, Viking explorers and settlers established communities across the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, and many other regions. Wherever they settled, they carried their customs about marriage, family responsibility, and partnership with them, shaping the social structure of new settlements. In these new lands, the importance of family relationships remained just as strong as it had been in their original homelands. A Viking household still depended on cooperation between husband and wife, as well as support from relatives and neighbors. Building a stable household in unfamiliar territory required careful planning and mutual trust between partners. When Viking settlers arrived in new regions, one of their first priorities was establishing farms. Clearing land, constructing houses, and preparing fields required tremendous effort. Couples worked together to transform rough landscapes into productive farms that could support future generations. These shared efforts often strengthened the bonds within families, as both partners relied heavily on each other's labor and decisions. The Icelandic sagas provide valuable glimpses into the lives of these settlers. Many of these stories describe how families traveled to new lands and built communities from the ground up. They tell of strong marriages where couples supported one another through long winters, uncertain harvests, and the challenges of living far from established settlements. In some sagas, we see women playing powerful roles within these new communities. Women sometimes managed farms when their husbands were away on voyages, made important decisions regarding household management, and even participated in negotiations between families during disputes. Their ability to maintain stability within the household was essential for the survival of Viking settlements. Another interesting element of Viking relationships involved legal protections within marriage. Norse law codes recorded in medieval texts show that marriages were recognized agreements with clear expectations for both partners. These laws often addressed matters such as property ownership, inheritance rights, and responsibilities toward children. For example, certain legal traditions ensured that women retained rights to property brought into a marriage. If a marriage ended through divorce or death, these possessions could remain connected to the woman or her family. This system helped protect family wealth and ensured that resources were not unfairly lost through marriage arrangements. Divorce, while not extremely common, was still possible within Viking society under certain conditions. If a husband failed to support his household or behaved dishonorably, a woman could sometimes dissolve the marriage through a formal process, witnessed by members of the community. This ability suggests that Viking women possessed a degree of legal recognition that was unusual for many societies of the same period. The presence of these legal structures reveals how seriously Viking communities treated marriage agreements. Relationships between couples were not simply private arrangements, but recognized parts of the social and legal framework that governed Norse society. Religion also influenced how Viking communities viewed relationships. Before the arrival of Christianity in Scandinavia, the Norse followed a belief system centered around gods, such as Odin, Thor, and Freyja. Many of these deities were associated with themes of love, fertility, and family life. Freya, for example, was often connected to ideas about attraction, beauty, and emotional bonds between people. Stories about the gods frequently explored relationships and human emotions, reflecting the importance of these experiences in everyday life. These myths and religious traditions helped shape cultural attitudes toward family life. They provided symbolic examples of loyalty, conflict, and reconciliation that people recognized within their own relationships. As the Viking Age progressed and Christianity gradually spread through Scandinavia during the later centuries, some traditions surrounding marriage and family life began to change. Christian teachings introduced new ideas about religious ceremonies and moral expectations within relationships. Over time, these influences blended with older Norse customs, creating a mixture of traditions that shaped later medieval Scandinavian societies. Despite these changes, the core principles that had guided Viking relationships remained visible. Cooperation within the household, loyalty between partners, and the importance of maintaining family reputation within the community. Across farms, villages, and distant settlements, the partnerships between men and women continued forming the foundation of Viking life. Their cooperation ensured that farms remained productive, children were raised with the skills needed for survival, and communities remained connected through shared traditions. And as the Viking Age slowly approached its later centuries, the legacy of these relationships continued shaping Norse society, leaving behind stories and historical traces that still help us understand the human side of one of the most fascinating cultures of the early medieval world. As Viking society matured during the later centuries of the Viking Age, the customs surrounding marriage and relationships continued evolving alongside the changing world around them. Trade routes expanded, settlements grew larger, and new cultural influences slowly entered Scandinavia. Yet, even as these changes unfolded, the core structure of Viking family life remained deeply rooted in tradition. The household continued to function as the center of social organization, and relationships between husbands and wives remained essential for maintaining stability within that structure. In Viking culture, the strength of a household depended heavily on cooperation between partners. A successful farm required constant planning, organization, and labor throughout the year. While one partner might focus on external tasks such as fishing, travel, or trade, the other often ensured that daily life within the household remained organized and efficient. These responsibilities were not isolated from one another. They worked together as parts of a single system that supported the family's survival. The environment in which Vikings lived made this cooperation especially important. The northern climate was unpredictable, and long winters meant that families needed to store enough resources to last through months when crops could not grow and travel was limited. Every harvest season became a crucial time for gathering and preserving food supplies that would sustain the household during the darker months. Women frequently played central roles in these preparations. Managing stored food required careful planning to ensure that supplies lasted until spring. Grain needed to be protected from moisture, dried fish and meat had to be properly preserved, and dairy products required attention to prevent spoilage. These tasks demanded skill and experience, making the management of household resources one of the most important responsibilities within Viking family life. At the same time, men often traveled long distances as traders, explorers, or warriors. The Viking Age is remembered for its voyages across the seas, which brought Norse sailors to many distant lands. While these journeys have captured the imagination of historians and storytellers, they also meant that households sometimes spent long periods separated from the men who had left on expeditions. During these times, women frequently assumed leadership within the household. They supervised workers, maintained the farm, and made decisions that ensured the property continued functioning smoothly. Archaeological discoveries and historical texts both suggest that women were capable managers who kept households stable during their husband's absence. Children growing up within Viking households observed this system of shared responsibility from an early age. They watched their parents cooperate to maintain the farm and learned the practical skills necessary for survival in their environment. Young boys and girls gradually took on tasks appropriate to their age, helping with chores and learning the traditions that would guide them into adulthood. Education in Viking society did not take place in formal schools as we might imagine today. Instead, knowledge passed from one generation to the next through observation and participation in daily activities. Children learned farming, navigation, craftsmanship, and household management by working alongside their parents and elders. This system of learning strengthened family bonds while ensuring that practical knowledge remained preserved within the community. Every household served as both a workplace and a classroom, where young members of the family developed the skills needed for their future roles. Another aspect shaping Viking relationships was the constant awareness of reputation. Because communities were relatively small and tightly connected, a family's reputation could spread quickly among neighbors and travelers. Maintaining respect within the community therefore became an important priority for many households. Honor remained a central concept within Norse culture. A person known for reliability, fairness, and loyalty gained the trust of others, which could strengthen trade relationships and alliances between families. Couples who maintained stable households and fulfilled their responsibilities contributed positively to the reputation of their entire family. Disputes within marriages occasionally appeared in the historical record, especially in the Icelandic sagas where personal conflicts sometimes escalated into larger family feuds. These stories reveal that relationships, like in any society, could experience tension and disagreements. However, they also demonstrate how important it was to resolve conflicts carefully in order to avoid damaging family honor. As time passed and Viking society continued interacting with other cultures through trade and exploration, new influences slowly blended with traditional Norse customs. Christianity gradually spread across Scandinavia during the later Viking Age, bringing different religious ideas about marriage and family life. Despite these changes, many older traditions remained visible for generations. The emphasis on strong partnerships within the household, shared responsibilities, and loyalty between family members continued shaping daily life in Norse communities long after the age of Viking voyages began to fade. Looking back at the Viking world through historical sources, it becomes clear that relationships between men and women were deeply connected to the practical realities of survival. Marriage formed the foundation upon which farms operated, children were raised, and communities remained stable through the challenges of the northern environment. Through these partnerships, Viking families created systems of cooperation that allowed them to thrive across vast regions of northern Europe. Their relationships were not simply personal connections, but essential components of a society built upon resilience, shared labor, and enduring traditions that defined the Viking Age. As the Viking Age continued unfolding across Scandinavia and the wider Norse world, relationships between men and women remained closely tied to the realities of daily survival. Viking society was built upon cooperation between members of the household, and these partnerships shaped nearly every aspect of life within farms and villages. The stability of a household often determined whether a family could prosper through difficult winters, uncertain harvests, and the constant challenges presented by the northern environment. Inside a typical Viking settlement, the household operated almost like a small community of its own. Multiple generations frequently lived together under the same roof or within the same cluster of buildings. Grandparents, parents, children, and sometimes extended relatives shared responsibilities that ensured the farm continued operating throughout the year. Within this system, the relationship between husband and wife formed the center around which the rest of the household functioned. Daily routines required careful organization. Livestock had to be fed and sheltered, fields needed tending during the warmer months, and tools required maintenance to remain useful. Food preparation alone could involve a wide range of tasks, including grinding grain, baking bread, preserving fish, preparing dairy products, and storing supplies for winter. These responsibilities were not limited to a single individual, but shared across the household under the guidance of the leading couple. Women played an especially important role in overseeing many of these domestic systems. The management of stored food supplies was a critical responsibility because survival during the long winter months depended on careful planning. If food was wasted or improperly preserved, the consequences could affect the entire family. Because of this responsibility, women gained respect for their skill in maintaining the resources that sustained the household. Archaeological discoveries often support this view of women's authority within Viking homes. Excavations of graves have uncovered women buried with keys, household tools, and valuable items that symbolized their role as managers of domestic life. These objects were not merely decorative but represented the responsibilities and influence women held inside their communities. At the same time, men often engaged in activities that connected the household to the wider world beyond the farm. Fishing expeditions along the coasts, trading journeys between settlements, and voyages across distant seas all required skill and courage. These activities brought valuable goods and resources back to the household, strengthening its economic stability. The combination of these responsibilities created partnerships where both individuals contributed essential skills to the success of the household. Viking marriages therefore functioned as cooperative alliances built upon shared labor and mutual dependence. The survival of the family depended on how well these partnerships operated. Children growing up within these households witnessed this cooperation every day. From an early age, they participated in chores and gradually learned the tasks required to maintain the farm. Young boys might assist with caring for animals or repairing tools, while girls often helped with weaving, food preparation, and household organization. However, the practical demands of life meant that both boys and girls learned many skills necessary for survival. This upbringing prepared children for adulthood within the same social structure. As they matured, they would eventually establish their own households, continuing the cycle of partnership and responsibility that had shaped Viking society for generations. Storytelling also played an important role in shaping cultural ideas about relationships. During long winter evenings when outdoor work slowed, families gathered around the fire inside their longhouses. Elders shared tales of famous voyages, legendary warriors, and powerful rulers whose actions shaped the history of the Norse world. Many of these stories also included lessons about loyalty, honor, and the responsibilities that came with marriage and family life. Through these narratives, young listeners learned about the values that guided relationships within their society. The sagas did not only entertain audiences but also reinforced cultural expectations about how individuals should behave within their households. Honor remained one of the most powerful guiding principles within Viking communities. A family's reputation influenced their relationships with neighbors, traders, and allies. Maintaining trust and loyalty within the household, therefore helped preserve the family's standing within the wider community. Disputes between couples occasionally appeared in historical accounts, especially within the dramatic storytelling of the sagas. These conflicts sometimes escalated into larger family disputes when accusations of dishonor or betrayal were involved. Such stories remind us that Viking society, like any other, experienced moments of tension and disagreement. Despite these challenges, the strong emphasis on cooperation and responsibility within Viking marriages helped maintain stability within communities spread across the harsh northern landscapes. Couples relied on one another to manage farms, raise children, and navigate the uncertainties of life during the Viking Age. Through these partnerships, Viking families built resilient households capable of surviving long winters, difficult harvests, and the constant demands of maintaining a farm in a rugged environment. Their relationships formed the foundation of a society that would leave a lasting legacy across the history of Northern Europe. As Viking society moved gradually through the later centuries of the Viking Age, the traditions surrounding relationships, marriage, and family life continued shaping the structure of Norse communities. The harsh northern environment, the demands of farming, and the expectations of honor and loyalty all played roles in defining how couples lived and worked together. Within every village and farmstead, These partnerships formed the backbone of society, allowing families to survive and grow across generations. One of the most important aspects of Viking family life was the concept of shared responsibility. Unlike modern societies where individuals might specialize in narrow roles, Viking households required flexibility and cooperation from everyone involved. Every member of the household contributed to the survival of the family, and the partnership between husband and wife guided the organization of these responsibilities. The Viking farm functioned as both a home and a workplace. Fields of barley or rye surrounded the farmhouses, while livestock such as sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs provided food and materials essential for daily life. Managing these resources required careful attention throughout the year. Crops needed planting and harvesting, animals required feeding and shelter, and supplies had to be stored properly to last through the winter months. Women were often responsible for overseeing the storage and distribution of these supplies. This role placed them at the center of household management, ensuring that food was prepared efficiently and that resources were used wisely. The careful preservation of food allowed Viking families to endure months when fresh supplies were limited. At the same time, men often traveled beyond the farm in search of opportunities that supported the household economy. Fishing along the coasts, trading goods in distant markets, or participating in voyages that carried Vikings across the seas, all contributed to bringing wealth and resources back to the family. These journeys sometimes lasted for extended periods, meaning that households needed strong leadership even in the absence of one partner. Women frequently managed farms during these times, supervising workers and ensuring that daily tasks continued without disruption. Historical evidence suggests that many Viking women were capable administrators who maintained stability within their households while their husbands traveled. Children growing up in these environments learned the importance of cooperation early in life. They observed the efforts of their parents and gradually joined in the work that sustained the household. Learning through participation allowed knowledge to pass naturally from one generation to the next, preserving the traditions that defined Viking society. Beyond the practical tasks of daily life, relationships within Viking communities were also influenced by social gatherings and communal traditions. Seasonal festivals brought families together to celebrate harvests, religious rituals, and important events within the community. These gatherings included feasts, storytelling, and music that strengthened bonds between families. Such events also provided opportunities for young people to meet potential partners. In a society where families often arranged marriages, these gatherings allowed individuals to interact and form impressions that might influence future marriage agreements. While family interests remained important, personal connections sometimes played roles in shaping relationships. The Norse belief system also contributed to the cultural understanding of relationships. Stories about gods and legendary heroes frequently included themes of loyalty, attraction, jealousy, and partnership. Deities such as Freya were associated with love and beauty, reflecting the Norse recognition that emotional bonds were an important part of human life. These myths and legends helped reinforce cultural ideas about how relationships should function within society. They reminded listeners of the importance of loyalty, courage, and respect within partnerships and family life. As Christianity gradually spread into Scandinavia during the later Viking Age, new religious influences began shaping marriage traditions. Christian teachings introduced formal church ceremonies and additional expectations regarding relationships. Over time, these influences blended with existing Norse customs, gradually transforming aspects of family life within Scandinavian societies. Despite these changes, many of the core values that shaped Viking relationships remained consistent. Cooperation between partners, dedication to the household, and the importance of family honor continued guiding daily life within Norse communities. Through these partnerships, Viking families created stable households capable of enduring the challenges of their environment. Their relationships formed the foundation upon which farms thrived, children were raised, and communities remained connected across vast and often harsh landscapes. Looking back across the centuries, the lives of Viking couples reveal a society where relationships were deeply integrated into the practical realities of survival. Marriage was not only a personal connection, but a vital alliance that sustained households and shaped the history of the Viking world. As the Viking Age continued moving toward its later centuries, the structure of Norse family life remained firmly built around cooperation, loyalty, and the responsibilities shared between partners within the household. The everyday lives of Viking couples were shaped by the demands of their environment, the expectations of their culture, and the traditions passed down through generations. These elements together created a social system where relationships were deeply connected to the stability of families and the survival of communities. The Viking household was not only a place where people lived, but also the central unit of economic life. Farms were the primary source of food and resources, and maintaining them required constant effort. Crops had to be planted and harvested during short growing seasons, animals needed careful care and protection, and supplies had to be preserved for long winters when travel and farming were difficult. Every task contributed to the survival of the household, and the partnership between husband and wife helped coordinate these efforts. Within this system, men and women often worked in different areas but with shared goals. Men frequently handled activities such as building ships, fishing along coastal waters, hunting in nearby forests, and traveling for trade. These activities connected Viking households to wider networks of exchange and communication that stretched across Northern Europe. Women, meanwhile, oversaw many essential responsibilities within the home. Textile production was one of the most important tasks carried out by Viking women. Creating cloth from wool required spinning thread, weaving fabric, and crafting garments that protected families from the cold northern climate. These textiles were not only used by the household, but also traded in markets, making textile production an important part of the Viking economy. Food preparation also demanded skill and careful planning. Bread made from ground grain, preserved fish, dairy products, and smoked meats formed the basis of many Viking meals. Ensuring that food supplies lasted through the winter required knowledge about storage techniques and preservation methods that had been developed through generations of experience. The management of these resources placed women at the center of household organization. Archaeological discoveries often show women buried with keys or tools that symbolize their authority within the home. These items indicate that women held respected positions as managers of the household economy. Relationships between couples were also shaped by the strong sense of community present in Viking villages. Neighbors frequently cooperated during important seasonal tasks, such as harvesting crops or constructing buildings. These collective efforts strengthened bonds between families and reinforced the idea that individual households were part of a larger social network. Because of this interconnected structure, maintaining harmony within relationships carried importance beyond the household itself. Disputes between couples could sometimes influence the relationships between families and neighbors, especially in smaller communities where everyone knew each other closely. Honor and reputation therefore continued to play significant roles in shaping behavior within relationships. Viking society valued individuals who demonstrated loyalty, responsibility, and fairness in their actions. Couples who maintained stable households contributed to the reputation of their families and strengthened their standing within the community. The Icelandic sagas again offer valuable glimpses into how these relationships were understood. Many stories describe couples supporting one another through difficult circumstances, including harsh winters, dangerous voyages, and family conflicts. These narratives highlight the resilience and cooperation that were often required to maintain stability within Viking households. Children growing up in this environment learned these values naturally through observation and participation. They saw how their parents worked together to maintain the farm and how decisions were made within the household. By helping with chores and learning practical skills, children gradually prepared themselves for the responsibilities they would one day carry as adults. This process of learning ensured that the traditions guiding Viking relationships continued across generations. Each new household formed by young couples represented the continuation of cultural practices that had been shaped by centuries of experience living in the northern world. Even as Viking explorers established settlements far beyond Scandinavia, these traditions traveled with them. Norse settlers carried their ideas about family life, cooperation, and partnership into new lands such as Iceland and Greenland, where they built communities that reflected the same cultural foundations. Looking across the Viking world, it becomes clear that relationships between men and women were deeply integrated into the broader structure of Norse society. Marriage created partnerships that supported farms, raised children, and connected families through alliances that strengthened entire communities. Through shared responsibilities, mutual reliance, and cultural expectations, Viking couples built households capable of enduring the challenges of their environment. These partnerships formed the quiet but powerful foundation upon which the wider Viking world was built. As the Viking Age continued unfolding across the cold coasts and rugged valleys of the Norse world, the rhythms of daily life remained deeply tied to the partnership that existed within each household. Viking society was not built only upon warriors, voyages, and battles as popular stories often suggest. Instead, the real foundation of Norse civilization rested inside farms and villages where families worked together to maintain stability, raise children, and protect the reputation of their households. Within this environment, relationships between men and women developed through shared responsibilities and long traditions that guided how families lived together. Life inside a Viking settlement followed patterns shaped by the seasons. During spring and summer, the land demanded constant attention as families prepared fields for planting and cared for animals that would provide milk, meat, and wool. The arrival of warmer months brought long days filled with work, where couples often labored side by side, ensuring that crops were planted properly and that livestock remained healthy. These efforts were essential because a successful harvest determined whether a household would survive the coming winter. Autumn became the most critical period of preparation. Crops had to be gathered quickly before the colder weather arrived, and food preservation began in earnest. Grain was dried and stored, fish were salted or smoked, and meat was carefully prepared to last through months when fresh supplies were limited. Women often supervised these preparations, using knowledge passed down through generations to ensure that the household's resources would last until the following spring. While these domestic responsibilities formed the backbone of family life, Viking men often carried out tasks that connected the household to the wider world. Fishing expeditions along coastal waters provided additional food supplies, while trade journeys brought goods from distant regions. Viking traders traveled across rivers and seas, linking Scandinavia with markets in Europe, the British Isles, and even distant parts of Asia through long networks of exchange. These journeys sometimes kept men away from home for extended periods. During these absences, the household depended heavily on the leadership of women who managed farms, organized workers, and ensured that daily life continued smoothly. Historical records and archaeological findings both indicate that Viking women were capable leaders who maintained stability within their homes during such times. Inside the longhouse, family life remained closely connected. Viking homes were communal spaces where multiple generations often lived together. Grandparents, parents, children, and sometimes extended relatives shared responsibilities and supported one another in maintaining the household. Evenings were often spent gathered around the central fire where families shared meals and listened to stories told by elders. Storytelling held an important place in Viking culture because it preserved the history and values of their people. Through sagas and legends, listeners heard tales of brave explorers, loyal companions, and families who endured great hardships together. Many of these stories included lessons about loyalty within relationships and the importance of maintaining trust between partners. Honor remained a powerful concept within Norse society, influencing how people behaved toward one another. A household that demonstrated reliability, fairness, and strong cooperation earned respect within the community. Couples who managed their responsibilities well strengthened the reputation of their families and created stability within the village. At the same time, disputes between individuals sometimes appeared in historical narratives, especially within the Icelandic sagas where personal conflicts occasionally escalated into wider family disagreements. These stories remind us that Viking relationships were complex and shaped by human emotions such as jealousy, pride, and loyalty. However, they also show how important it was to resolve conflicts carefully in order to protect family honor. Children growing up in Viking households absorbed these values through everyday experience. They observed how their parents managed the farm, shared responsibilities, and interacted with neighbors and relatives. Through participation in daily tasks, children gradually learned the skills required to maintain a household of their own in the future. This cycle of learning ensured that Viking traditions surrounding family life continued across generations. Each new household established by young couples carried forward the customs that had supported Norse communities for centuries. Across Scandinavia and the distant lands settled by Viking explorers, these partnerships between men and women remained essential for maintaining the strength of society. Through cooperation, resilience, and shared responsibility, Viking couples built households that could endure harsh winters, uncertain harvests, and the many challenges of life in the northern world. These relationships formed the quiet but enduring foundation of Viking civilization, supporting the farms, villages, and trading networks that allowed Norse culture to flourish across vast regions of northern Europe. As the Viking Age slowly moved toward its final centuries, the traditions that shaped relationships, marriage, and family life continued guiding the daily rhythm of Norse communities. Long after the famous voyages and explorations began to fade, the foundations of Viking society remained rooted in the households that dotted the landscapes of Scandinavia and the settlements established across distant lands. These households were the true centers of Viking life, where partnerships between men and women ensured the survival of families and the continuation of their cultural traditions. Looking back at the Viking world, it becomes clear that relationships between couples were shaped by a balance of practical responsibility and social expectations. Marriage created a partnership that allowed two individuals to combine their skills, labor, and resources in order to maintain a stable household. A farm required constant attention throughout the year, and the success of the household depended on the cooperation of both partners. The northern climate demanded careful planning and preparation. Long winters meant that families needed to gather and store enough food to survive months when fresh supplies were limited. Crops harvested in autumn, livestock raised through the year, and preserved foods prepared inside the home all contributed to the household's ability to endure the colder seasons. Women played an essential role in managing these systems. Their knowledge of food preservation, textile production, and household organization allowed families to maintain stability even during difficult periods. The presence of keys in many Viking women's graves symbolizes the authority they held over the resources stored within the household. Men, meanwhile, often connected the household to the wider world through fishing, hunting, and travel. Viking traders and explorers established routes that carried goods and ideas across large parts of Europe and beyond. These journeys sometimes lasted months or even years, leaving women responsible for maintaining the household in their absence. This balance of responsibilities created partnerships built on trust and shared effort. Couples depended on one another to ensure that farms remained productive and that children were raised with the skills necessary to continue the family's traditions. Through cooperation and resilience, Viking families maintained communities capable of surviving in harsh environments. The Icelandic sagas and historical records preserve many stories that reflect the complexity of these relationships. Some tales describe couples who supported one another through challenges and adversity, while others reveal conflicts that arose from jealousy, pride, or disputes between families. These narratives demonstrate that Viking society, like any other, experienced both harmony and tension within relationships. However, the emphasis on honor and reputation encouraged individuals to maintain stability within their households. A family known for reliability and strong partnerships earned respect from neighbors and allies. Maintaining this reputation was important because Viking communities depended on cooperation between households during harvests, construction projects, and seasonal gatherings. Over time, the spread of Christianity across Scandinavia introduced new traditions and ceremonies surrounding marriage. Churches began performing formal wedding rituals, and religious teachings gradually influenced ideas about relationships and family life. Despite these changes, many older Norse customs continued to shape how families lived and worked together. Across farms in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, and other Viking settlements, the structure of family life remained remarkably consistent. Couples formed partnerships that balanced responsibility, cooperation, and trust. These relationships supported the households that served as the building blocks of Norse society. When modern historians study the Viking Age, they often focus on dramatic stories of exploration, raids, and legendary warriors. Yet behind these famous events existed the quieter reality of family life that sustained Viking communities for generations. The relationships between men and women, shaped by shared labor and cultural traditions, formed the true foundation of Viking civilization. Through these partnerships, families built homes, raised children, managed farms, and passed down knowledge that preserved their culture across centuries. The strength of Viking society did not come only from the bravery of its explorers or the power of its warriors, but also from the resilience of the households that supported them. And as the long Viking Age eventually faded into the later medieval period, the legacy of those households remained woven into the history of Northern Europe. Their traditions of cooperation, responsibility, and family partnership continued influencing Scandinavian societies long after the great voyages had ended. If you enjoyed this slow journey through the hidden side of Viking life and the traditions that shaped their families and relationships, consider supporting the channel by liking the video and subscribing so we can continue exploring more fascinating stories from the past together.